When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. These words from the psalmist beautifully capture the profound joy and excitement of the Jewish people as they returned to the land of Israel after their long exile. A season of desolation gave way to consolation and hope as they rebuilt their lives and renewed their covenant with God. As we reflect on their journey, what steps can we take to renew our relationship with God during our own seasons of rebuilding? And how can the joy and resilience of Israel's return to Zion inspire us to persevere when we face challenges in our own journey of renewal? Shalom and welcome back to God's Story, Our Story, Catholics for Israel's online Bible course. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve. Last time we walked alongside Israel during their Babylonian captivity, a time of darkness, yet not without hope. Through the extraordinary visions of Daniel, God revealed the rise and fall of mighty nations and announced the return of his people to their homeland. Daniel also received stunning prophecies about the restoration of Jerusalem and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth by the Son of Man and a mysterious Messiah who would be cut off. Today we turn to a new chapter in Israel's story, a time of joy as the Jewish people return to Zion. They rebuild the temple, resettle in their land, and renew their covenant with God. Yet this period is not without struggle. Opposition arises from within and without. The kingdom of David is not restored. The Holy of Holies lies empty, and foreign powers continue to rule over the Jewish people. Amid these challenges, Judaism undergoes profound transformation, and a deep longing grows for the promised kingdom of God, a kingdom to be ushered in by the Messiah. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and post your questions and comments below. Return to Zion. The Second Temple Period. The two major books that we cover today are Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, these two books were originally considered to be one book, and they are often seen as a continuation of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The traditional author of both books is the scribe Ezra, and they were completed around the year 400 BC. Now, the setting is the Persian Empire, and we are looking at two distinct periods. First, an immediate post-exilic period from roughly 538 to 515 BC, and that is covered in Ezra chapters 1 to 6. Then the narrative moves forward to a later time, around 458 to 433 BC, and that is covered in Ezra chapters 7 to 10 and the whole book of Nehemiah. Both books are written mostly in Hebrew with the exception of two passages in the book of Ezra, which are written in Aramaic. And so Ezra is the second book of the Hebrew Bible alongside Daniel that has some substantial sections written not in Hebrew but in Aramaic. Here is our map of the ancient Near East, and as we saw last time in our study of the book of Daniel, Cyrus the Great and his Persian Empire conquered the entire ancient Near East, including the former kingdom of Babylonia. And we can see on the map how this empire of the Medes and the Persians was in fact much larger than the previous empire of Babylonia and previously the empire of the Assyrians. So here is our massive Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. We're going to look at three returns from exile. A first return under Zerubbabel, at which time the Jews are going to rebuild the temple. Then, following this gap of 57 years, there's going to be a second return under Ezra, and after a shorter gap of 12 years, a third return under Nehemiah, and that is when the Jews are going to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. So once again, here are the three returns under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So the Jews return to Jerusalem in three waves. First, Zerubbabel leads the first wave in 538 BC, covered in Ezra chapters 1 to 6. That is the time of the ministry of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, and under this first wave of returnees, the temple is going to be rebuilt in 516 BC. Then Ezra leads the second wave in 458 BC. That is covered in Ezra chapters 7 to 10, and that is roughly the time of the prophet Malachi, the last of the Hebrew prophets. Finally, Nehemiah leads the third wave in 445 BC, and that is covered in the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is going to lead the people to rebuild the walls of the city. Here are the kings of Medo-Persia, some of which we saw last time in our study of the book of Daniel. So we've already talked about Cyrus, who conquered Babylonia in 539 BC. He's mentioned a few times in Daniel and also at the beginning of the book of Ezra. We talked about Darius the Mede, who is mentioned in Daniel 5 and 6, but is otherwise unknown outside of the Bible. Then Cambyses and Smerdis are not mentioned in the scriptures, but then the book of Ezra mentions Darius I, Xerxes, otherwise known as Ahasuerus, and Artaxerxes I. So Darius I is mentioned in both Ezra and Haggai. Ahasuerus or Xerxes I is the king in the book of Esther, and then Artaxerxes I is mentioned in both Ezra and Nehemiah. So that is the political situation of the Persian kings at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. What is the theology of these books? We are looking at a physical but incomplete restoration. So it's a time of hope, but also a time of disappointment. We are looking at a time of covenant renewal of the Jewish people with God. They have learned many lessons from their exile, and indeed they will never return to some of the grave sins that they committed before the exile, such as crass idolatry. We are looking also at God's people who are one with pre-exilic Israel. Obviously, there is continuity between the people who were sent into exile to Babylonia and now those who are going to return from Persia. This is the fulfillment of the promises of a second Exodus that many of the prophets promised, and it is also a testimony to their faithfulness to the Torah. We know that they were exiled because they failed to keep the Torah, and so we're going to see a real time of conversion and return to the law of God as they resettle in the land. God's people are going to be united in this great enterprise of returning to the land, but at the same time, God's people, the Jews, are going to be separated from all the other nations around them. This was always the plan since the time of the Exodus, but it did not always work out so well, and we're still going to see some challenges at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's a time of renewed temple worship after 70 years being without a temple. This is really an exciting time of returning to the worship of God as he had commanded since the times of the sanctuary in the wilderness. And we're also going to see a refocus on the importance of Scripture. We know that during all this time in Babylonia, when they had no temple and no sacrifices, the only thing that could keep their faith together was the study and reading of Scripture. And we see this renewed devotion to the Scriptures, to the Torah, to the law of Moses in these books of Ezra and Nehemiah. We also see a strong focus on prayer as the people of Israel understand and recognize that they very much need God's help to rebuild their nation. And so God's grace is going to be absolutely essential in this time of rebuilding. Let's look at the first return that occurred around 538 BC. In the first year of his reign, Cyrus, the king of Persia, permits the Jews to return to Jerusalem and build the temple. Can you imagine the excitement after this captivity? It seemed like it was the end. It seemed like God's covenant had failed. But now, lo and behold, this new king of Persia, who is indeed tolerant and relatively benign towards his subjects, he allows the Jews to return back home. The temple vessels are entrusted to a certain Sheshbazzar, who is prince of Judah, and off we go with this first return under Zerubbabel, which is described at length in Ezra chapter 2 with the names of all the leaders and the Levites and the priests who will return in this first wave of returnees. I just mentioned that Cyrus is remembered as being a relatively benevolent emperor, and we see this attested by the Cyrus cylinder. This is the cylinder that you can see on the screen, And it indeed confirms that Cyrus was well disposed towards his subjects. So look at what he says on this Cyrus cylinder, and I quote, "As to the holy cities beyond the Tigris River, whose sanctuaries had been in ruins over a long period, the gods whose abode is in the midst of them, I returned to their places and housed them in lasting abodes. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. Furthermore, I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great lord, all the gods of Sumer and Akkad whom Nabonidus had brought into Babylon to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed in their former chapels, the places which makes them happy. May all the gods whom I have placed within their sanctuaries and resettled in their sacred cities address a daily prayer in my favor before Bel and Nabu, that my days may be long, and may they recommend me to him, to Marduk my lord. They may say, May Cyrus the king, who worships thee, and Cambyses his son, all gods I settled in a peaceful place. I sacrificed ducks and doves. I endeavored to repair their dwelling places." So the Cyrus cylinder confirms that Cyrus allowed the people who were subject to him to return to their lands and in fact to rebuild their sanctuaries, asking them at the same time to pray for him. So we really see a good relationship here between this emperor and the Jews and other peoples who were subject to him, quite unlike the former Babylonians and Assyrians. Once the Jews return, under the leadership of Zerubbabel and the high priest Yeshua, which is the same name as Jesus, the priests rebuild the altar, they keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and they offer sacrifices. So the altar is the first step towards the rebuilding of the temple so that they may offer sacrifices to the Lord. They also rebuild the foundation of the temple, then give thanks and praise to the Lord. And at this point, we even have some of the elders who weep because they already realize that, wow, this temple is not going to be as magnificent as the Temple of Solomon. It is indeed going to be much more modest. So it's a mix of joy, thanksgiving, but also of sorrow. Unfortunately, soon after the work is begun, opponents are jealous and they interrupt the building of the temple for 15 years. They even appeal to Cyrus's successor in Persia and ask the emperor to command the Jews to stop building the temple. And so work is halted for some time until the prophets Haggai and Zechariah show up, and they exhort the people to continue and resume the building of the sanctuary. We are now around 520 BC. In the second year of his reign, Cyrus's successor Darius I decrees that the temple should be completed. So it's 520 BC, and the work on the temple resumes. This is going to take some 4 years, so the temple is completed in the 6th year of the reign of Darius in 516 BC. And this happens to be exactly 70 years after the Temple of Solomon was destroyed. So we see the prophecy of Jeremiah that the Jews would be in exile for 70 years comes to pass exactly if we count the exile as the time between the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple. We have exactly 70 years. So it's a time of extreme joy. The priests and the people dedicate the temple with joy, offering sacrifices and celebrating the Passover in the first month. But the temple is modest compared to Solomon's temple, yet God promises through the prophet Haggai, saying, "The glory of this latter temple shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts." So even though physically the temple is smaller and not quite as magnificent as Solomon's temple, there is this prophecy, this oracle, anticipating a greater glory to come in this second temple. We are now in 458 BC. Some 58 years later, this is the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, the scribe Ezra leads a second wave of Jews back to Jerusalem. We are now in Ezra chapters 7 and 8. Leaders inform Ezra that many Jews have intermarried with pagan foreigners. This we know is a big problem because intermarriage with pagans was one of the causes that led Solomon and his successors to fall into apostasy, into sin, leading the whole people into exile. So Ezra is very troubled by this. He prays and confesses the guilt of the people to God. And then Ezra calls the people to separate themselves from their foreign wives, which they do. So we see a certain humility here in the people who actually listen to Ezra as he commands them to return to faithfulness to the law of Moses. That's already a quick survey of the book of Ezra, and we then move to the book of Nehemiah and Nehemiah's own return. We are now in 445 BC. It's the 20th year of King Artaxerxes of Persia. Nehemiah is still over there in Persia, and he receives bad news from Judah, saying this at the very beginning of the book of Nehemiah. The survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Nehemiah is very troubled by these news, so he fasts and prays, then asks the king to send him back to Judah to rebuild the city. The king agrees, he grants his request, and issues a decree to rebuild the gates, the wall, and the city. And if you recall from our study in the book of Daniel, this decree in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes was our point of departure as we calculated the prophecy of the 70 weeks of the book of Daniel that led to 32 BC for the coming and cutting off of the Messiah. Nehemiah sets out and makes his way back to the land of Judea. He arrives in Jerusalem and promptly goes out at night to inspect the walls of the city, and he resolves to build them. But he's going to need much courage, much wisdom, and much endurance and perseverance. Here is his assessment of the situation of the city. You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. Nehemiah also faces opposition from Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab. And so we see this coalition of foes of the Jewish people who do everything they can to stop the work. Nevertheless, Nehemiah endures and perseveres. So we read about the building of the wall and gates in Nehemiah chapter 3, and because the opposition and threats increase, Nehemiah has to set guards to watch over the construction. And so we see the determination and the sacrifice of these men who are partly rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and also partly guarding their own work of construction. So this would have required tremendous sacrifice, dedication, and hard work, as much as courage and faith and trust that the Lord would lead their enterprise to success. In addition to this, we see poverty, famine, and even the oppression of the poor by the nobles and officials. So as we see in every situation of rebuilding, we see a certain elite class who try to take advantage of the situation and who are not so interested in sacrificing anything, but rather they want to profit from others. And so this leads to poverty and famine, and the poor who are quite destitute at this time of great need in Judah. Nehemiah understands this, and he even forsakes his allowance because Nehemiah is now the governor of Judah, and so he is willing to forsake all of his privileges and himself continues to lead this rebuilding at the cost of great sacrifice on his part. Opposition continues, and there is even a conspiracy against Nehemiah's life, which he manages to evade and continues with great perseverance the work of rebuilding the walls and the gates. Here we see a map of Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah. We see all the various enemies that threaten the work from all sides. So the Philistines, the Arabs, the Samaritans, and the Ammonites. You can see the walls that are in the process of being rebuilt, and the temple that still has some ruins up there on the Temple Mount. So as you can see, Jerusalem was quite small at the time of Nehemiah. It was much smaller than it had been previously at the time of Hezekiah and before the destruction of the city at the hand of the Babylonians. Finally, all of their perseverance pays off and the work is completed. The wall is finished on the 25th of the month of Elul after only 52 days of work, and you can read about that in Nehemiah chapter 6. Nehemiah goes on to appoint guards over the rebuilt walls and gates in chapter 7, and then we can read about the list of all the returned exiles that constitute some 42,000 people plus their servants. Here we see a good illustration of the city as well. So you can see the city of David here and the walls that Nehemiah rebuilt, the Temple Mount being up here and the newly rebuilt temple. And over here on the left, you can see the ruins of the former city that had been expanded at the time of King Hezekiah before the exile. And so this was still in ruins and largely abandoned at the time of Nehemiah. So the city of Jerusalem was quite modest compared to its previous glory under the Solomonic Empire. It's time for the renewal of the covenant. All of the people gather by the water gate, and Ezra publicly reads the book of the law of Moses. So the people have to remember this is not just a building enterprise of reconstructing the walls, but it's also a spiritual construction of rebuilding ourselves, our community, and our souls, and returning to faithfulness to God's law and to God's promises and to God's covenant. So after they hear this long proclamation of the Torah by Ezra, the people eat and drink before the Lord and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So this is truly a covenantal renewal, somewhat similar to when the Israelites ate and drank before the Lord at Mount Sinai and sealed the Mosaic or Sinai covenant. Now it's a renewal of the covenant as the people come back to God and hope in his promises anew. They fast and pray, and Ezra recalls the great deeds of the Lord, which is also a typical covenantal moment, recalling all the great things that God has done in the past and trusting that he will continue to do great things in the future. So the people renew the covenant with God and even take an oath to walk in his law. So this is very positive and quite a difference from the unfaithfulness that we saw before the exile. Nehemiah and the leaders then set out to rededicate the wall. At the dedication of the wall, 2 large thanksgiving choirs march on the wall in opposite directions, singing songs of thanksgiving and praise to God. So truly a time of great joy and hope and thanksgiving as they rededicate the walls of Jerusalem to God and to his service. So they offer sacrifices, and we can read about the renewed temple service in Nehemiah chapter 12. Again, they feel the imperative of separating themselves from foreigners, and this is a challenge that we continue to see even after the exile, and that's a concern of Nehemiah in his final reforms at the end of the book. After 12 years governing Judah, Nehemiah has to return to Persia for some time, and so we read of him returning back to Jerusalem and seeing still these challenges, seeing opposition, and seeing intermarriage and some lack of fidelity on the part of some of the people. So he expels Tobiah the Ammonite from the temple because we know that foreigners were not allowed in the sanctuary. And he notices also that the Levites have been neglected so that they have fallen into poverty. So he takes care of that situation. He also notices that there are violations of the Sabbath, and so he calls for Sabbath reforms. We recall that the Sabbath was the sacred time marking the covenant between God and Israel, and so it's very important for them to observe the Sabbath faithfully. Finally, Nehemiah condemns mixed marriages that are still around, recalling Solomon's sins. Remember that Solomon started off his decline by various mixed marriages with pagan women, and so that is Nehemiah's last act of reform. So as we come to the end of the book of Nehemiah, we can only be impressed at his fortitude, his perseverance, his faith, his trust in God, and how many lessons there are for us as we often find ourselves in situations in life where we need to rebuild ourselves, rebuild our lives, perhaps starting a new job or a new season in life. And we can see in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah all the great virtues that they demonstrate for us to emulate and to imitate as we also enter into these seasons of rebuilding in our lives. We continue our study of post-exilic Judaism as we depart from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so how did Judaism undergo a great transformation after the exile? As we know, it was a time of great hope, but also of substantial disappointments. Why? Because the Davidic kingdom is not restored. There is still no king in Judah. The Jews are still under foreign occupation at this time, the Persians. Moreover, the Ark of the Covenant is lost. This means that the Holy of Holies in the temple is empty, and so there is a sense of absence there. Even though the people believed that God was with them spiritually, the seat of the divine presence in the Holy of Holies was absent. Judaism becomes reoriented around the Torah. I've already mentioned that because of the exile, when there was no temple and no opportunity to offer sacrifices, by necessity the Jews needed to focus their faith on the Torah. We also see some developments in Jewish literature. This is the rise of eschatology and apocalyptic literature. Judaism begins to form an elaborate theology of the end of time, in which a deliverer would defeat once and for all the forces of evil. And so this probably derived from the fact that when they returned to the land of Israel, they thought that this must be the Messianic times. We're now returning to Judah. This is the new Exodus. This is the time of our final redemption. But as they see that they have no Jewish king, they have no Ark of the Covenant, they start hoping for the end of time when God will truly break forth and reveal his reign among his people. And so this is the time of a rise in Messianism. There is increased expectation for the Messiah, who is thought to be both a political and a religious leader. We also see a shift in focus from this world to the next world. Judaism adopts more elaborate beliefs in the afterlife, where good is rewarded and evil is eternally punished. So we see all these themes being developed in intertestamental literature in the Second Temple period. At this time, we also see the rise of this well-known institution called the synagogue. We never hear about synagogues before the exile, but when we return from exile, the synagogue becomes a central institution in Judaism. During the exile, the Jews had no more temple or sacrifices and had to preserve their religion in the midst of pagan customs and gods. This called for an interiorization and universalization of their faith. What does this mean? Interiorization, deprived of the external signs of their religion, that is, temple and sacrifices, the Jews had to interiorize their faith through prayer, study, observance of the law, and so on. Universalization, worship was no longer centered on Jerusalem but had to take place wherever the Jews were, so the Jews had to be able to sustain their faith anywhere, not just in Jerusalem. So the synagogue arises to fill these two needs. It's not a place for sacrifice and worship, but for teaching and fellowship. And from that time on until today, the synagogue remains possibly the central Jewish institution. Recall the clash between the ram and the goat in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, and recall what we said back then, that this clash between the two animals represented the battle of Galgamela between Darius III and Alexander the Great. And indeed, this prophecy of Daniel comes to pass in 331 BC. Alexander the Great defeats Darius III of Persia, and this decisive victory of the Macedonians leads to the fall of the Persian Empire and the rise of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. So here we go with Alexander the Great and the Greek rule. Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire in 333 to 331 BC. Recall Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue and Daniel's interpretation in Daniel chapter 2. The head of gold was Babylon. We just saw the torso of silver, which represented the Medes and the Persians, and now the thighs of bronze, and this is going to be the Greek Empire. Judea becomes a province of Alexander's empire in 331 BC. So we see that Alexander conquers now the entire ancient Near East, including much of Egypt. Under the Greek Empire, we see a new phenomenon occurring for the Jewish people. With the growth of commercial opportunities, Jews migrate to colonies throughout the known world. This becomes known as the diaspora. So instead of a forced exile, as we saw under the Babylonians, Jews for the first time have the freedom and opportunities to migrate on their own. And that's the difference between diaspora and exile. Diaspora Jews learn the Greek language and adopt Greek customs and ideas. So Greek now becomes the lingua franca of the known world, the international language, which is going to replace Aramaic. And so all Jews that form these new Jewish centers such as Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, and even as far as Rome are going to start learning Greek as the international language. During this period, many of the Jews also forget how to read and understand Hebrew, so the scriptures themselves are translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC, and this is what we know today as the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament. Alexander's reign was short-lived. He dies in 323 BC, and as we saw last time in our study of the book of Daniel, the Greek Empire is divided by his 4 generals. Cassander takes over Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus takes over Thrace and Asia Minor, and most importantly for us students of the Bible, Ptolemy takes over Egypt and Seleucus takes over Syria. At first, Judea is under the control of the Ptolemies for about 1 century, and then in 198 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III defeats the Ptolemies and conquers Judea. At first, things are okay for the Jews, but soon after, the Seleucids begin a campaign of Hellenization, forcing them to abandon their faith for Greek paganism, and this is going to lead to the greatest crisis for the Jewish people after the exile. Here is a map that we've seen before in our study of the book of Daniel. As you can see here, there is the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt that controlled Judea for a little more than 1 century, and then the Seleucids in Syria are going to take over Judea, and they will be the ruling power. In 175 BC, the next Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, inherits the throne, and he begins a very aggressive campaign of Hellenization. In 169, after a campaign in Egypt, he returns and attacks Jerusalem, plundering the temple, and then a couple of years later, he launches a full-scale persecution against Judaism. He outlaws the observance of the Sabbath and circumcision. He dedicates the temple to Zeus, defiles it with Gentile cults, even sacrifices pigs upon the altar, and he sets up what Daniel anticipated, the so-called abomination of desolation in the sanctuary. He even goes as far as persecuting and killing faithful Jews who refuse to abandon the Torah. So we see here a massive crisis in the persecution of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was known as Madman in his fanaticism to wipe out the Jewish religion. This is going to lead to the breaking point for the Jews and the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. And so as this persecution is still going on, the priest Mattathias and his 5 sons launched the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks. After a bitter struggle, the Jewish forces managed to defeat Syria and the Greeks. In 164 BC, the Maccabees even recaptured Jerusalem. They purify and rededicate the temple. And this word in Hebrew for dedication is Hanukkah. And so here we see the origins of the feast of Hanukkah. There's this apocryphal tradition that they only had enough oil to last 1 day, and as they went to find some more oil, the oil that they had miraculously lasted for 8 days, and this is why the Feast of Hanukkah is today 8 days long. In 142 BC, after more than 2 decades of fighting, the Maccabees forced the Seleucids to retreat from Palestine and Judea. The Jews regained their independence, which they hold for 80 years. And so for the first time since the return from exile, the Jews managed to establish a Jewish kingdom in Judea. And this is going to be known as the Hasmonean Kingdom or Hasmonean Dynasty. So the Hasmoneans are the successors of the Maccabees. Under the Hasmonean dynasty, the kingdom regains boundaries not far short of Solomon's, and so they expand their territory to a respectable size. There is an expansion of the kingdom, a political consolidation, and a flourishing of Jewish life at this time of renewed independence for the Jewish people. This also leads to a counter-reaction against Hellenism, and we see some new books that are going to be written and will be included in the Catholic Bible, books such as the books of Maccabees and the book of Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon, and we're going to see a re-Judaization of these later books of wisdom, whereas the previous books such as Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes did not have a whole lot of connections with the history of Israel. When we look at books like Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon, they become very connected with Hebrew or Israelite salvation history. Unfortunately, and ironically, later Hasmoneans become more and more Hellenized. And so whereas their forefathers, the Maccabees, fought bitterly against the Greeks, against the Seleucids, many of whom lost their lives in this long war against the Greeks, the later Hasmoneans, their descendants, become more and more Hellenized and willing to compromise with the Greek way of life. So here we see our complex Hasmonean dynasty from Mattathias, Judas Maccabeus, Jonathan Maccabeus, Simon Maccabeus. So they were the zealous warriors that fought against the Seleucids, and they are succeeded by John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus I, Alexander Jannaeus, and the more we go down this line, the more and more the Hasmoneans are going to compromise with the Greek way of life and becoming more and more lukewarm about observing the Torah and remaining faithful to God's covenant, to the point that the purists among the Jews will completely reject the Hasmonean dynasty as being a completely illegitimate kingdom and certainly illegitimate priesthood, which they also appropriated after some time. Now, in this time of increasing crisis, this is when we see the rise of new factions in Judaism, factions that are very well known from the New Testament. So 3 main religious factions emerge under Hasmonean rule. The first are the Pharisees. These are the spiritual fathers of modern Judaism. They believed in the divine authority of the oral law, of rewards and punishments in the afterlife, and in the coming of the Messiah. So they are going to become the fathers of modern Orthodox Jews. Their bitter rivals, the Sadducees, were the priestly caste. They were more willing to compromise with Hellenism and later cooperate with the Romans. The Sadducees rejected the oral law and belief in the afterlife. Thirdly, we have the Essenes, who believed that the other groups were all corrupt. They moved out of Jerusalem and lived a monastic life in the desert, adopting strict dietary laws and a commitment to celibacy. So we don't hear a whole lot about the Essenes in the New Testament, but many have said that perhaps John the Baptist himself was an Essene. And of course, we are well familiar with the Pharisees and Sadducees from the Gospels. At this time after the exile, what did Judaism look like? A lot like this triangle that we have seen throughout our study of the Old Testament. And so how did God speak to his people? Through the prophetic word of the scriptures. We still had priests in the temple who mediated God's life through the temple liturgy. And now there was no king in Israel, or the Hasmonean kings were not necessarily recognized by all. And so now we have the Pharisees who dominated the Sanhedrin, this council that would have legislated the Jewish law to the Jewish people. We continue to follow the Hasmonean dynasty. After Alexandra Salome, the queen, we had this rivalry between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. We are now in the 1st century BC, and this rivalry becomes so bitter that both of these factions appeal to this new empire that is rising far in the west, and that, of course, is the empire of Rome. And so what is going to happen? Rome is indeed going to intervene, but they will take control. So General Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC, and at this point, the remaining Hasmoneans will just be puppet kings. So Pompey makes Hyrcanus II high priest and ethnarch, and he has a certain advisor who is named Antipater the Idumean, and this Antipater has a son who is named Herod. Antigonus reigns from 40 to 37. He is also a puppet of the Romans. The son of Aristobulus II is going to be the last Hasmonean because he goes to war against the son of Antipater, Herod, and Herod is going to ruthlessly eliminate all of his opponents to become the king of Judea. So the Hasmonean dynasty ends definitively in 37 BC, and now Herod is appointed as puppet king of the Romans from 37 BC to 4 BC. This obviously is a time of the rise of Rome. As we said, in 63 BC, General Pompey conquers Jerusalem. In 47 BC, the kingdom of Judea becomes directly subject to Rome. And in 37 BC, the Romans appoint Herod to become king of Judah. 27 BC, Augustus founds the Roman Empire, and this Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, brings peace and ease of travel in the Roman world. So here we see the new map of now the Mediterranean world. As you can see, the map shifts to the west because we are no longer dealing with empires based over here in the east, such as Babylonia or Persia, but then we had Greece, and now we have the Roman Empire that controls the entire Mediterranean world, including Judea. Herod the Great, of course, is well known from the Gospels as a ruthless ruler, but also a great builder. So as we said in 37 BC, the Romans appoint Herod to become king of Judea. He becomes one of the most powerful monarchs in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. He launches a massive construction program and rebuilds the temple into one of the most magnificent buildings of its time. As we said, the temple built by Zerubbabel and the Jews at that time was quite modest, so Herod is going to greatly expand this temple of Zerubbabel. It's not really a separate temple, but it's a great expansion of the second temple, as you can see here on this illustration. And here's another illustration of the splendor of Herod's temple. So Herod was, on the one hand, a mass murderer, but at least he was a great builder, and we have this as his legacy. As we come to the end of our study today, we are looking at a new occupation in Judea. Now the Romans are ruling. Herod is the puppet of the Romans. He's a ruthless king. And the Jews at this point are groaning, longing for the kingdom of God to come. And this is why by the beginning of the Common Era, there are high messianic expectations among the Jews. They believe the Messiah to be the instrument by whom God's kingdom is to be established in Israel and in the world. And in their popular conception, the Messiah is the royal son of David who will bring victory and prosperity to the Jewish nation and set up his throne in Jerusalem. The return to Zion was a season of profound hope and joy. Yet it was also marked by challenges and disappointments, as the Jewish people sought to rebuild their lives in the land of Israel. Under the weight of foreign occupation, their longing for redemption deepened, a longing for the coming of the Messiah, who would redeem Israel and establish the kingdom of God on earth. Join us next time as we delve into the Bible's messianic prophecies to uncover the identity of this awaited Messiah.